Now we're going to start scaffolding our models, and what this will give us is essentially a set of pages that lets us interact with the data models and create, read, update and delete items in the database based on the models that we've already set up. So let's get stuck in. The instructions that we'll be following are from here, and of course we're using Visual Studio. So the first thing we need to do is create a new folder, a students folder within the pages folder. And this is because we are going to scaffold our students entity first. So to create a new folder within the pages folder, we right click on pages and we go add, and we'll go new folder and we'll call that students. Then we can right click on that folder we just created and select add new scaffold item. So let's do that. Add new scaffold item. So then we'll get this window appear, and the next step is to look on the left tab and select installed common Razor pages. So installed common Razor pages. This filters the items that we can select from just for convenience. And we want to select a Razor pages using entity framework. CRUD. So that's the last one here. This will generate our Razor pages using entity framework, and it will give us the create, delete, details, edit and list operations for the given model. And in this case we're going to select the students model. So we'll click on add. So the next window we'll get is this, where we're adding our Razor pages using entity framework, and we need to choose our model. So if we select the drop down, we can see we have a set of models appearing already based on our project. So we want to select student and the data context class. Now in the tutorial, it wants us to create a new data context called school context. Now this project is a little bit different because if you remember from the beginning, we already set up the login and registration functionality, which has its own database migrations, which also has its own data context. And then we can actually see that in the drop down here. So application DB context. Now, if we were to create a separate database context, what that would mean is that when we run our application, we would end up with two different databases, and that data would be split between them. So each context essentially represents a different connection or a different data storage mechanism. For most projects though, we would want to store our data in a single database context so that we can use the data through our application. So we're going to use this existing one for now. If you haven't set up login and registration in the original app, then you'll want to follow the instructions as per the tutorial. So you want to create a new data context class and follow these steps carefully. In this tutorial though, we are going to continue with the application DB context, and when we're done, we will click on add. So here we can see that Visual Studio is installing some NuGet packages. So these are packages that support the generation of our Razor pages based on the models, and it's all powered by Entity Framework. So it's automatically installing packages into our project that it needs to do what we just asked it to do. Now at this point, if you received a big nasty error in Visual Studio, don't panic. There is a reason that in the tutorial they put this line here: if the preceding step fails, build the project and retry the scaffold step. So what you didn't see, because I wasn't recording at the time, I did in fact receive a huge kind of error warning at Visual Studio, and so it said it failed to generate the scaffolded pages. But what I did was essentially try it again, and lo and behold, the second time it worked. This is a good lesson in not panicking when something goes wrong, particularly with Visual Studio development. Sometimes things will fail. We don't really understand why, but there are a few things that we can try if something does fail. One good approach is to essentially try it again, just in case there was something that wasn't quite right the first time that's then been fixed in the background when we run it again. If all else fails, we can try rebuilding the project, and even, it's been known to fix some issues, restart Visual Studio. There's a chance that something in the background is not quite set up correctly. Visual Studio can get itself into a bit of a tangle. Sometimes even restarting Visual Studio, reopening your project can help. So an important lesson there, just to show you what success looks like. So in the output in Visual Studio, we got confirmation that the pages, Razor pages, were created along with each of their page model code behind files. So you can see here the summary. We've got a create page, edit page, details page, delete page, and index page. And if we check those in our Solution Explorer, you can see in our pages folder, we've got our students folder that we created earlier, and here we have all of our pages and their code behind files. So just having a little look at these, the create page, we can see here, it's mostly HTML. There's some .NET specific tags used here, but essentially if you have a look, you can see that we have an input here for the last name. We have an input for the first name, enrollment date, and then a submit button. So this is a basic form for creating a new student. Similar with details, it's a read-only view of the student details. Edit is similar to the create form, but it preloads the content and we can edit it to be different to the create page if we wanted to. And then the index page is the listing page with a link to the create new page. And we'll see what this looks like when we run the app shortly. But here we have the table, so table headings, and then the actual data, which is outputted from our data context. We're getting the student entities from the data storage, the database context, and then echoing out or outputting essentially the values for the last name, first name, enrollment date in these table data cells. And then the final column is a set of links where we can edit or view the details or delete each one. So this seems successful. It's generated all these pages for us, and we can do the exact same thing if we wanted to for enrollments or courses. We're not going to quite do that at the moment. First, let's carry on with the tutorial and see what that scaffolding has done. Let's just remind ourselves of the database connection string in the app settings.json file. So this is down at the bottom of Solution Explorer. Let's open up app settings.json. And here we have this is the same connection that we have, or that we had earlier when we set up the login and registration functionality with .NET Core Identity. So if you remember, when we scaffolded our pages, we didn't set a new database context. We used the existing one, and that's why we have a single connection string, which is what we want. A little tip I want to share with you here to do with Visual Studio and our code editor is to enable word wrap. As you can see, when viewing lines of code that are longer than our visible window area, it can be a little bit cumbersome to scroll horizontally. My preference is to enable word wrap so that the code actually wraps within the width of the visible area. And to do this within Visual Studio, you click on Tools and Options, and then you can search for wrap and go into the text editor, all languages, general. And we have here, if you go into this section, you'll see this window here, and I'm going to enable word wrap and go OK. And then we can see there that now that's wrapping the text, so I can see all of it without having to horizontally scroll. We get the little icons on the edge of the visible area that just shows that that's text that's been wrapped It hasn't actually changed the file, it's just changing how we view it. Okay, so we have a few more steps to go through before we can actually run the app and check that it's working. This next step is to update the database context class as shown in the instructions here in the tutorial. Note that we are not editing a school context.cs file, because in this example we have chosen to use the application DB context, which is the default context that came with the project when we enabled identity and login and registration functionality. If you are following this tutorial exactly and you prefer and you didn't enable identity and you did create a school context database context, then please update this file as appropriate. But the changes we're going to make are the same either way. So I'm going to select this and copy it. What this is doing, it's setting up in this central database context. It's telling the application that it can look for or it can use these entities and that they can be stored in the database, essentially. So at the moment, we have students set up, and that was automatically set up when we implemented the scaffolding. But we are going to set up the remaining as well, just in preparation for the remainder of the app. You'll notice in the default created code here on line 13 of this code, it's set up the DB context for a student entity, and it's explicitly noted the location of that student model. Now, because we are including a using statement up here, we can actually delete that if we wanted to, and it wouldn't error out. And as you can see in the code that's suggested here as well, it is just using the entity name rather than the full path. So let's use this code. We'll just replace this for convenience. Okay, there we go. A note from the instructions that actually we've changed the code from a singular reference of student to plural, students. And so we actually need to update this in several places to make this work. The reason we're going to make this change is just for demonstration purposes of how to deal with a change like this, but also because it's often conventional to use the dbset property as plural, because it's actually representing multiple items. So what we need to do here is to update the incorrect references. So just to demonstrate that, let's try rebuilding, and we'll likely see some errors. Okay, so when we try to rebuild, we are in fact getting a series of errors, 13 to be precise. And if we look at the error, again, not to panic is the key advice, but actually just to read through the error, what it's telling us. So it's telling us application DB context does not contain a definition for student. That makes sense because we've defined it now as students. And this error is being thrown in the create.cshtml.cs file. So let's go into that. And the only create file we've got is in the students, pages students folder. So if we go into this create file, and if we scroll down, we can in fact see where it's underlining the issue. And that's because we're referring to it as singular. So if we corrected that to plural, we can see then that the error goes away. Okay, so we could go through our code and manually do this. We can actually see just by correcting that issue, we've got 12 errors now, so that's cleared one. If we just go through a few more manually, and we can see that error count go down. Here we've got one here. Student, change to students. So there's a couple there, and now we're kind of reducing our error count, which is great. What we can do, in fact, why don't we do a find and replace? So if we look for underscore context.student, so we can use Control F for our find tool, and if we choose the search context to the current project, let's search for, just to specify it, we'll add a dot at the end so we know it won't capture the students. Let's do find next. So you can see if I step through them, it's finding them for me. It's opening different files now, so that's great. Let's have a go at doing a global replace. So I'm going to copy and paste that, but just add our students. And what we can do here, we can replace next, or we can replace all. Let's give it a go. Cool, so we had 6 occurrences replaced. We've still got some errors. Let's just double check where these are occurring. So if we double click on the error, it can open it for us. So there's just some to sweep up. Let's just fix these manually. So we'll change that to students. Change that to students. Almost there, 1 to go. And there we go. I am going to save all. There we go. Let's try rebuild. Okay, so trying to rebuild actually threw up another error that we'd missed. One instance of student. I'm going to change that to students. Not sure again why it didn't show up in the original scan. But let's try rebuilding again. Okay, so now we have a successful rebuild. Again, a clean build, so we're in a good place. The next step in the tutorial isn't to make any code changes, but just to have a look at the program.cs file and see what's been added. So if we open program.cs, the tutorial highlights some bits that have been added already. So in our case, we haven't called it Contoso University, it's John Test Project, and our equivalent line of code is here. So we're using the .data namespace essentially, which is pulling in the relevant data models, and Entity Framework Core, or EF Core. This is what powers our scaffolding and the use of models throughout our application, and we can see that that's there as well. Notice in our example, we actually have ASP.NET Core Identity enabled as well. That's because we enabled authentication when we created this project. But if you didn't do that, then you won't see this line. A couple of other lines, well actually just one more line, the add.db context. We have this here on line 9, where it's added the application DB context. We have a few other lines here because we have identity enabled. Okay, so that you may or may not have those depending on whether you set up identity at the beginning of the project. Next step is to add a database exception filter, which just helps us with longer term troubleshooting. So let's follow the instructions here. So we'll add this line of code into our program.cs file. So we'll add it before our builder.build line. And then let's copy these lines. Notice in our version, we actually already have an if-else statement for this is in development mode. And what we want to change, I'll add these 2 lines here. The next part of this step, it's asking us to install a package via the Package Manager Console, or PMC. And to do this, let's find the PMC, Package Manager Console. And we can find the Package Manager Console via the Tools menu, NuGet Package Manager, and then Package Manager Console. This then initializes the PowerShell command line. And what we're going to do is install this package that it's asking us to do. So this is good practice if you need to install packages via the NuGet package manager in the future. So let's paste it in and hit enter. So when that's done, which was pretty quick, we can then verify that that has indeed attached itself to our project by going into our project file, the John's test project.cs project file, and then we can see there is a package reference. We now have this ASP.NET Core.Diagnostics.EntityFramework.Core. So we're almost there now. Our next step is to ensure that our program.cs file creates our database if it doesn't exist. Now in this example, we already have a database because we set up and ran the login and registration functionality with identity. We're going to delete that database and then get the application to create it from scratch using our models. If you didn't enable identity, then you won't have a database to start with. But let's go through these steps and just make sure we're comfortable with what's going on. So the code it's asking us to add in program.cs is highlighted here. So let's open up program.cs. And it's below this if statement for its development, which is here. So we're working with our code here. Let's copy this here. Okay, so we pasted that code in here. We're getting an error because we're referencing the wrong database context. Let's see if Visual Studio is smart enough to suggest a fix for us. No, so it's suggesting we actually create the school context class, which is not what we want to do. If you can remember, the database context we have, as shown on the Solution Explorer over here, is application DB context. So let's update that. And we can actually see there in the IntelliSense autocomplete, we have it there. So if we hit the down arrow, we can hit enter, and there we go. We've got application DB context properly referenced. Good. So the line of code here on line 40 in my example, context.database ensure created. This is what's going to make sure that the database is created if it doesn't exist. If a database already exists, it will take no action. So as it stands in my example project, because I already have a database, because I've set up identity and run the migration to create the database, it won't do anything. So we're going to actually need to delete that database, which we'll do shortly, so that when we run the app, it will create our database with the necessary tables, which we defined in the application DB context. So when that ensure created command gets executed, it will create these three tables for us in a database. Note that this workflow is only suitable in early stages of a project where we're happy to delete our database and recreate it. As we mentioned earlier in this video series, the better way of managing a database schema or the database structure is by using migrations, and we will come to that later in this video series in more detail.